I'm Dr. Orion Taraban, and this is PsycHacks, Better Living Through Psychology. And the topic of today's short talk is how to overcome approach anxiety. Most men have approach anxiety. It's very rare for a man to feel naturally confident in his ability to go up to a woman he doesn't know, strike up a conversation, and move the interaction in the direction of a sexual relationship. The ability to do these things is a skill set that men can and do learn. But it's difficult to do so as it requires overcoming a significant fear. As I mentioned in a previous episode, this fear is deeply rooted in an unconscious association between female rejection and the threat of extinction. So it's very difficult to eradicate, and it may never go away entirely. However, it absolutely can be reduced to manageable levels. Today, I'm going to be talking about how to do this. Now, overcoming approach anxiety isn't much different from overcoming any other fear. The way to do it is to do it. You could watch hundreds of videos just like this one and read a bunch of books and take some courses and purchase expensive coaching sessions. But ultimately, the only way to overcome approach anxiety is to approach women. There's no way around it. If you approach enough women, you should gradually diminish this anxiety. And if you do everything else except approach women, it's unlikely that you're going to move the needle in an appreciable way. The trick is to actually do the thing and have an emotionally disconfirming experience. In this case, that means approaching enough women to emotionally trust that all other things being equal, approaching women is a non-terrible experience. And if you have to do it, in my opinion, it's best to rip the Band-Aid off and take massive action. This is because it might take hundreds of approaches before your emotional programming begins to shift. If you approach women here and there once or twice a week, then it could take you years before you hit that critical threshold. That's a significant amount of time. A while back, I worked with a man in his 20s to overcome his approach anxiety. He did it in a weekend, but he had to approach 676 women. And from the way he described it, let me tell you, this man went on an emotional journey over those 48 hours, from his initial fear and terror to pain and shame, to rage and contempt, to hopelessness and despair, until ultimately he arrived at emotional indifference. And to his amazement, this wasn't an indifference he had to fake or an indifference he had to try to maintain. It became his default baseline. But to arrive here, he had to be rejected enough times to emotionally understand that no is just information. It doesn't have to hurt, it doesn't have to be personal, and it doesn't have to be permanent. And when he arrived here, he was positively rapturous. He told me it was the first time in his life he ever felt truly free. It was a real breakthrough, and he did it in a weekend, and some guys won't do it in 10 years. Obviously, it wasn't a very comfortable weekend, but, it might not otherwise have been a very comfortable decade. Now, before I go any further, if you're liking what you're hearing, please consider sending this episode to someone who might benefit from its message, because it's word-of-mouth referrals like this that really help to make the channel grow. You can also hit the super thanks button, the 3 little dots in the lower right-hand corner, and tip me in proportion to the value you feel you've received from this message, because it's your support that makes all this happen. I really appreciate it. Now, let me talk a little bit about how to approach a woman confidently. As many of you know, I used to be an actor. Some people have this belief about acting, that acting is lying. And I would counter that bad acting is lying. Good acting, on the other hand, is telling the truth under imaginary circumstances. Good actors are honest. They're authentic. It's the situation that's made up. So let's talk about how to tell the truth under imaginary circumstances from the perspective of an actor. Let's say that you're playing a character whose pet rabbit died, and he's supposed to be completely crestfallen. And let's also say that you couldn't care less about rabbits. Maybe you even hate rabbits with their beady little red eyes and their constant stench and their unfriendly nature, and you could give a shit if a rabbit died. Obviously, you couldn't ask yourself, how would I feel if my pet rabbit died? It wouldn't work for the scene. So what you would have to do in the privacy of your own mind is either evoke a memory or elaborate a fantasy as vividly and as realistically as possible that would actually cause you to feel crestfallen. And you would focus your mind's eye on that memory or fantasy as intensely as possible. Externally, you'll be saying your lines or following your blocking. You'll exist in the artificial construct of the scene. But internally, you'll be focused entirely on your imagination. You'll actually be present to whatever memory or fantasy you've elaborated in your mind. And it's this skill of being simultaneously aware of external reality while focused on the internal imagination that makes for good acting, that allows for people to be truthful under imaginary circumstances. It's a skill, which means, like any skill, it can be learned. So what does this have to do with approaching women? Well, if you're in a bar and the scene calls for you to approach an attractive woman, and you ask yourself, well, how would I feel about approaching an attractive woman in a bar? If you're like most men, you're going to think, well, I would feel nervous about that. But that's not what the scene calls for, right? So let's assume the scene calls for confidence and poise. What can you do? Well, in the privacy of your mind, you can either evoke a memory or elaborate a fantasy as vividly and as realistically as possible that would actually cause you to feel confident and poised, and you can focus your mind's eye on that memory or fantasy as intensely as possible. If you can do this, you can move through external reality while remaining focused on your internal imagination. And this will help you to act authentically and authentically confident in an imaginary situation. Now, you might respond, well, that's all well and good for an imaginary situation, Orion, but a bar is the real world. And I would counter, are you sure? Like, yeah, the bar exists in objective reality. However, if you examine yourself very carefully, you'll find that you have a whole host of beliefs about who you are and where you are and what's going on that do not exist in objective reality. You might even be scripting, like a playwright, the potential encounter in your imagination. My point is that if you have approach anxiety, you're already doing what I described. You're moving through external reality while remaining focused on an internal fantasy. It's just that your internal fantasy is negative and anxiety-provoking. So you already know how to do what I'm prescribing. And if you change the fantasy, you can change how you feel. One final note. One of my acting teachers once taught me that whatever I needed to think in the privacy of my own consciousness, whatever memory I needed to evoke or fantasy I needed to elaborate in order to produce that authentic emotional response was nobody's fucking business. So whatever works for you is for you and you alone. So have fun and go for it. What do you think? Does this fit with your own experience? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've gotten this far, you might as well like this episode and subscribe to this channel. You may also consider becoming a channel member with perks like priority review of comments or booking a paid consultation. As always, thank you for listening.